Last month, I released a video about Spice and Wolf's light novels. What I didn't touch on was how Yen Press handled the content of the novels themselves, or the people who worked with the company to bring these books westward. Today, we'll take a look at some of the most important people in this process, the translators. Paul Starr's interest in manga and anime began in the middle of the 1990s. At his local comic shop, he would buy any Japanese media he could find, and that's how he discovered Oh My Goddess. He fell in love with the manga, and it would end up having a large influence on his future career. Oh My Goddess was licensed by Dark Horse Comics, and it was initially published as individual chapters. At the end of chapter 2, there was a note left by one of the series' translators and a pioneer of English manga, Torrin Smith. This note was about the process of translating manga into English. For whatever reason, when he read it, he thought, hey, that sounds cool. Maybe I could do that. This didn't end up being just a passing thought. Fortunately, the school he attended actually taught a Japanese language class. After graduating, he attended the University of New Mexico. He took as many classes as he could, but UNM isn't exactly known for its extensive Japanese curriculum. After finishing his studies there, he decided to join the Japanese Exchange and Teaching, or JET, program, and was a part of it from 2002 to 2004. During his time teaching, he studied for the Japanese Language Proficiency Test, or JLPT. The JLPT has been used since 1984 as a reliable means of evaluating and certifying the Japanese proficiency of non-native speakers. The specific test that Paul was studying for was the equivalent of today's JLPT N2, the second highest level of linguistic proficiency, described as the ability to understand Japanese used in everyday situations and in a variety of circumstances to a certain degree. Paul finished his formal education in Japanese at the University of Hawaii, obtaining a master's degree in Japanese literature. While he was in graduate school, he did a bit of translation work through an agent, but he wanted to become a freelancer as soon as he could. However, he did have another job before he made the switch, and that was as a translator for New Type USA, the English version of the popular Japanese magazine. Before I was a freelancer, I was a full-time in-house translator for New Type USA, and one of the things I'd translate while there was a big spread on the upcoming Spice and Wolf TV series. Spice and Wolf didn't have an official title at that point, so I decided to translate it as The Wolf and the Spice. Side note, this issue of New Type USA was actually the last one released before the magazine ceased publication. Remember the agent that he worked with in grad school? That same agent eventually came to him with an opportunity. Paul would get the chance to submit a few test pages to Yen Press for a series by the name of Spice and Wolf. Yen Press liked his work and decided to have him handle the translation, which began in late 2008. When it came to the process of actually translating the novels, Paul's methods evolved over time. I've always been a lazy student, especially when it comes to kanji. So for my first several books, my first step would be to quickly read through the pages I planned to translate that day and look up all the kanji I didn't know, then pencil the kana in next to them. Then I would open my word processor and work through the sentences. Eventually I got familiar enough with the author's vocabulary that I didn't have to keep looking up the kanji for like profit and currency every time. However, having an entire novel in front of me to translate was constantly overwhelming. Even after I'd completed several volumes, each new one always felt impossible. There were some other rough things going on in my life at the time, and I barely remember translating the first several volumes of Spice and Wolf through the fog of terrible depression. Things got better and my process improved. By volume 10 or so, I'd gotten the idea to photocopy pages out of the book so I could have just the pages I was doing in a given day in front of me, instead of the entire novel, which helped make the work feel less impossible. Given the circumstances and the series' subject matter, I don't think that you'd be surprised to hear that it wasn't an easy series to translate, especially in the beginning. In some sense, everything was difficult. It was early in my translation career, and I was working entirely alone, so anytime I ran into a problem, I had to just muddle through. I made a lot of straight up mistakes, which I only discovered when I reread my own translation later in the process of reworking it for the manga adaptation. Spice and Wolf famously involves a lot of relatively intricate economics, and not only was I unfamiliar with the vocabulary, frequently I was unfamiliar with the concept itself. I remember having to look up the concept of buying commodities on margin multiple times, and since these concepts are closely intertwined with the characters' various motivations, understanding them was crucial to understanding the actions on the page. It was a constant challenge. I also had a lot to learn just from the perspective of pure language mechanics. I remember reading this essay in 2014 or 2015 and having my mind completely blown by it. In just a couple thousand words, Katherine Henman outlines things that took me years and years to learn. After a decade of translating Japanese fiction into English, I'd started to suspect things like, I think I can leave some of these adverbs out, or I bet I can phrase this with more certainty. But to see someone lay it all out so clearly and authoritatively was revelatory. I so wish she would have written it in 2007. So yes, some things were difficult. But in another sense, Spice and Wolf's fantasy setting was liberating. It's a subtle distinction to consider, but when you think about it, the characters of Spice and Wolf aren't really speaking Japanese. They're speaking the language of the world they live in. This gives translators a certain amount of conceptual freedom in how their speech is rendered that we don't have with the story set in the real world, with characters that are actually speaking Japanese. My job is to make sure that the English text cohered as well as the Japanese did, but in some sense both the English and Japanese editions were both trying to be faithful to the same imaginary third language that the characters were actually speaking. But to be clear, I don't mean to say that my translation is co-equal with Hazakura's original. His text is, by definition, always the authority. Paul ended up translating Spice and Wolf from Volume 1 to Volume 14, but he didn't find it difficult to maintain each character's voice over such a long period of time. That was actually no trouble at all. Isuna Hasakura's style is very consistent, which made keeping the series' voices consistent easy. Once I settled into the stylistic quirks of, for example, Holo's voice, it was never hard to get back into it, even after working on Haruhi Suzumiya or whatever. Even though the job of a translator involves reading and writing stories, a job is a job, and you're not going to have the same experience with a story that a normal reader would. The process of translation for me is very separate from how I personally feel about the work. I'm always trying to give the work the best possible presentation, even if it's not something I particularly like myself. But even if I do happen to like what I'm working on, that doesn't really make it easier. Deadlines are still deadlines. Professional stress is still professional stress. I would say in the moment I rarely enjoy the thing I'm translating. But sometimes I read over something later and get to think, hey, this is pretty good. In 2014, after the translation of Volume 14, Paul made another career change. Instead of continuing to work as a freelance translator, he was hired by Yen Press to be their in-house editor. In this new role, he wouldn't be able to continue translating Spice and Wolf and would have to find a new translator. And the person he found to take over was Jeremiah Bork. Jeremiah Bork grew up in Canada, and even though he spoke English when he was at home, the vast majority of his education was conducted in French. He was always drawn to Japanese cultural influences, even if he didn't realize it at the time, things like Robotech, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and Transformers. But his first true introduction to anime was Sailor Moon. Language issues have been a part of Canadian politics for a while, and doesn't look like it's going away anytime soon. Jeremiah's graduating class was one of the last ones to complete their studies at a bilingual institution before it was shut down and replaced by a school that only taught using one language. He had grown tired of it, and his interest shifted towards the Japanese language and culture. One of the things that pushed him over the edge was a chance encounter with Trish Ledoux, a teacher, author, and translator. I had a chance encounter with her over IRC a long time ago, and quizzed her about her view of the sub versus dub debate. She said Japanese isn't that hard to learn. Just learn it yourself and you can watch anime raw. By the way, the isn't that hard to learn, don't take that part literally, please. It's plenty hard. But I did it, hoping to get some kind of career in it. When he was still learning Japanese, he decided to pick out a book to test his reading ability, and that book just happened to be a popular light novel written by Isuna Hasakura. It was pure, absolute dumb luck that I chose in the first volume of Spice and Wolf years ago as something to test out my Japanese reading ability on, going in basically blind. So I had a grounding in the core characters and basic plot ideas. Again, random chance. I'd heard the series praised, but I'd never read a word of it before reading the raw Japanese of that first volume. Jeremiah works as a freelancer, and he got started working with Yen Press after responding to a mailing list. I worked with Yen Press after a few months since responding to an inquiry into potential translators through an old translator mailing list. This was right after my father passed away. I moved out on my own for the first time, and that was in flux. But despite a rocky start because of medical issues that kept me out of McDonald's work, they looked back at my trial translation and said they wanted me. Originally, this was targeted at Strike the Blood, and all these years later, I got the final volume, number 22, done. But shortly after, my managing editor and thus boss wanted me to do the volumes to wrap up the original Spice and Wolf novel series. Now also he was the translator of the earlier stuff, best as I understood it. So there was a safety net, but I still needed to bring every ounce of fortitude I had to the job. As for how he approaches the translation process, Jeremiah likes to start with the basics. Translation workflow is simple enough. If there's time to read well ahead, you do that. But since there's a lot of double checking and review of your own work no matter what happens, at the start I'm often just diving into the weeds and sorting out the grammar. Translation is vitally dependent on context, and Japanese writing depends on controlling the amount of context available at a given time. I'm not going to know everything, but neither does the reader. So I'm trying to be in the reader's shoes, but also in the author's head, guiding the thoughts from one language to the other with minimal loss of data, if you will. Whether that goes smoothly or difficult is usually all up to the complexity of a given sentence, thought, or scene. I just respond as circumstances require and work things out, and mark anything suspect for coming back to it later. As for series familiarity, Spice and Wolf was the exception to the rule. Usually it's dumb luck whether you know something about a given series or not, but there are always ways to educate yourself. I immersed myself in what I could. Unlike Paul, Jeremiah would be jumping into the series partway through, but he didn't have time to worry about what had already been translated. Paul Starr, I miss working with him. It's been such a long time. Anyway, I didn't have enough time to read his English work extensively or worry about it, because he was still available to edit as he saw fit, so I worried about the author's use of character voices. You're a better judge than I as to how it worked out in the end, but the simple fact is, in between the raw novel I read way back and volumes 15 to 17, they are very strong character voices. They resonate strongly, and reading in Japanese I found it difficult not to identify with them just by instinct. It's like I could hear in my head what everyone was supposed to sound like. That's to say if I saw an anime adaptation, I'd be like, yep, that guy's perfect. They nailed it in casting. That's how distinctive the voices felt to me in the middle of the process. So I just had to trust with Starr at my back. I just needed to call him like I see him, and any quirks during the long years of translating the previous novels would be applied in post, like it's a movie production. I tried to stay true to that instinct of what the voices felt like. Jeremiah had two things that he was worried about translating. Like Paul Star before him, one of those was the language of economics, and the other was the characters' voices. I don't think you'll find this a great revelation, but if there are two things that I was worried about, it was the aforementioned voice issue, hoping for the best with Star there backing it up, and the economic fiction aspect. That said, chalk this up to more dumb luck maybe, but I know enough about economics to loathe the subject in real life. I know plenty about gold standards and all that, theories of coinage. In other words, by sheer happenstance, I was a really good fit to dive into those issues in The Coin of the Sun without any flinching. The author's work in this matter speaks for itself. I just tried my best to live up to it and make it make sense to an English audience. Keep in mind, I had no time to ask anyone how I did. I had a huge pile of work back then. There was no navel gazing for me, especially because I knew there was nothing I could do to change anything after the fact. If anything, that was the most difficult part of it all. In the end, you just have to do your best and move forward. I also asked Jeremiah if he was able to enjoy the stories he translates, and this was his response. So you asked about enjoying the stories. Whatever hardships I have in work or life, it is my privilege and my joy to work with these stories. Not simply because I enjoy them as stories, not just because of all the work and effort and sweat that went into how they are crafted. I see in exquisite and excruciating detail how each paragraph, each sentence, each phrase was crafted for effect. Japanese is a language that offers more precision than English, and the authors whose works I've dealt with, they are masters of their craft. I don't mean perfection, I mean they're just that dedicated, hardworking, and devoted to pulling at a reader's thoughts, heartstrings, sense of drama, all to give a particular slant or feel to every part of a scene, every joke, every quip, every pun. I deal with them quite intimately, so I appreciate them in all their glory, and in the case of the puns, awfulness. In their original language, these are my heroes in life. They inspire me, and that makes me enjoy their stories even more. Besides, I'm at the epicenter of every the manga was better or the novel was better argument ever made, or so it feels like. I will see many stories at their best. I like the language already. Working on great stories is just the icing on the cake. Every volume of Spice and Wolf from 18 onwards has been translated by Jasmine Bernhardt. She loved Cardcaptor Sakura when she was in elementary school. When she learned that it was from Japan, she decided to teach herself Japanese. I was lucky my middle school or high school offered Japanese classes as well, so I started taking formal classes then. Her first experience in translation was an informal one. She decided to try her hand at translating a game. The longer answer is that when I was a senior in high school, and we got almost a whole month off to do our end-of-year senior projects, I decided to translate Tales of Hearts. It had yet to be localized for a Western audience at that point, and I hadn't played it yet. And most importantly, my friend owned a copy, so I snagged it off her. Sorry Alex, I don't know if you ever got it back. I'd also just come back from a semester abroad in Japan and had already played through a Tales of game entirely in Japanese, so I figured it'd be doable. In the end, I reached the end of the game and had, very badly, translated the entirety of the main story. It was a huge learning process, but hugely fun, and activated the translation circuits in my brain. There were a lot of missed meals and absurdly late nights though, which I do not recommend doing as a pro. While she was in college, she dabbled in some translation projects, but it was more of a hobby than anything else. After getting her bachelor's degree in Japanese, she decided to become a teacher and join the JET program, but after a while, she knew that it wasn't what she wanted to do. It turns out teaching doesn't mesh so well with my personality, so I came to the UK to do my MA in Translation Studies at Cardiff University in hopes of finding a bouncing off point. It was fascinating because a lot of what I'd learned were things that I had sensed instinctively while doing fan translations and translations for practice, but now they had names and reasonings behind them. My bouncing off point didn't come from my grad degree, however. It came from friends I'd made previously in my life. I owe my career to Carly Smith and Graham Howard. I literally would not be where I am without them today. It's thanks to their help, generosity, and a couple of past tests on my part that I started getting paid work. And the rest is history. One of those past tests landed her the Spice and Wolf translation job. While she'd heard of the series, it wasn't something that she was familiar with. While she'd have some research to do, she was given style notes and a list of terminology in order to ensure that things were consistent. When it comes to difficulties in translation, she specifically mentioned long sentences and having to play catch up. The absolute hardest part was catching up on 10 years worth of story before starting. But really, there are a lot of long sentences, some of which can be too long to be acceptable in English. So I had to spend a lot of brain power on figuring out how to word, reword, or rearrange these sentences so that the information is accurate and it reads well in English. Another thing translators have to deal with is to balance conveying important information with maintaining the original novel structure. I always make sure to keep all the necessary information from a phrase or sentence, things like plot points, character voice or narration register, emotion, specific word choices, etc., and render that in English, even if it means having to sacrifice some of the original structure. It's a tough balance to keep. Special thanks to Paul Star and Jeremiah Bork for answering so many of my questions. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to speak with Jasmine Bernhardt personally, so all the information about her was obtained from an interview conducted by Jennifer O'Donnell and an AMA that she did on our Spice and Wolf. Thank you all for watching. Until next time.